Learn Japanese history. Welcome to the deep dive.
We are your navigators, Taro and Hanako.
And today we're jumping straight into a really pivotal time for anyone starting out with Japanese history.
That's right, the Sengoku period, the famous Warring States era.
We're not just talking about the battles, though they were obviously a big part of it. We want to get into the architects of this age, the Sengoku daimyo, and really dig into how they actually, built their power and governed their territories.
Exactly. It's like a master class in, well, state building, but under extreme constant pressure.
So our focus today is really understanding the methods, the practical tools these daimyo used.
Yeah, the nuts and bolts of establishing authority and hopefully some prosperity in their domains. It's about the governance side, the innovations that came out of all that chaos.
Okay, so let's set the scene. The Sengoku period, late 15th century onwards, right? What really kicked things off?
Well, the big context is the Ashikaga shogunate. After the Onin War, its power just evaporated.
Living a vacuum.
A huge one. And this opened the door for ambitious local figures to rise up. It's a phenomenon called Geikokujo.
Gekokujo, heard that term, it means.
Basically, the lower overthrowing the higher.
Yeah.
Traditional hierarchies were seriously challenged.
So opportunity knocks for those ready to grab it.
Pretty much. If you had the skill, the ambition, the military strength, this was your moment. Understanding Geikokujo is like fundamental to understanding the Sengoku daimyo.
Right. So who are some of the first figures who really embodied this new type of leader? Any standout examples?
Oh, absolutely. A classic case, and really fascinating, is Hojo-san.
Hojo-san, okay.
He was originally known as Aise Sozui. And he wasn't, from the absolute top tier of the old aristocracy, but through really smart strategy and military skill, he managed to gain control of Izu and Sagami provinces.
Based where?
He took Odawara Castle. That became his power base.
Ah, Odawara, famous castle.
Exactly. And his family, the Hojo, went on to control a huge chunk of the Kanto region for generations.
Wow. So his story is a perfect illustration of that Gekokujo idea, talent over birthright.
Precisely. It shows how, in this period, ability and ambition could really break through the old structures. Makes you think, doesn't it? How much did traditional status matter when faced with pure capability?
Definitely. A real power player. Who else was making waves around this time?
Well, you also have huge figures like Yasugi Kenshin in Ichigo province. He started out as Nago Kajitora.
The Kenshin, the god of war.
That's the one, a legendary commander. And then his great rival, Takeda Shingen in Kai province, originally Harunobu.
Shingen, another brilliant strategist. Their rivalry is famous.
Oh yeah, their clashes, like at Kawanakajima, really defined the mid-16th century in that part of Japan. It wasn't just fighting over land, though.
Yeah.
It was also sort of a testing ground, different ways of organizing armies, different tactics, really pushing military thinking forward.
So were these Sengoku daimyo mostly these kinds of new men, or did some come from the older power structures?
That's a great point. It was actually a real mix, which is what makes it so interesting.
Okay.
Some daimyo definitely did come from the ranks of the old Shugo daimyo, the provincial governors the shogunate used to appoint.
Like who?
Clans like the Takeda, actually, and the Imagawa, the Otomo down in Kyushu, the Shimazu too, they had that continuity with the past.
Right.
But a lot of them, maybe even most, came up from lower down.
Right.
From the Kokujin local landholders, basically.
And local bosses.
Yeah, or even for the Shugo's own administration as deputies, the Shugo daims.
So a real blend of old families adapting and new guys rising up.
Exactly. It really highlights how much things were changing. The old system was breaking down, creating these new paths to power.
Okay, so let's say our daimyo has carved out his territory, his bunkoku. Now what? What's the game plan for actually running the place? What's in their instruction manual?
Right. The absolute core principle, the mantra you could say, was Fukoku Kyuehei.
Fukukuhe.
Meaning...
Enrich the domain, strengthen the military.
Makes sense. The two go hand in hand. Totally inseparable. You need a strong economy to support a strong army. And you need a strong army to protect and, well, expand your economic base.
So how did they go about the enriching the domain part, the fukoku?
A major focus was agriculture. Boosting food production was key.
How?
Big projects. River control, building irrigation systems.
Yeah.
Anything to increase the amount of farmable land and make it more productive.
Not just feeding people, but building a surplus.
Exactly. Surplus means taxes, means resources you can invest elsewhere, like in the military.
Okay, agriculture is foundational. What else on the economic front?
They also pushed other industries. Mining was big for some daimyo gold, silver,
Instant wealth.
pretty much.
Yeah.
And it attracts miners, merchants, skills. Others promoted cash crops, like cotton, which was becoming important.
Right.
And a really key development was the castle town, the Jokamachi.
Ah, yes, the towns that grew up around their castles.
But they weren't just accidental. They were often planned economic centers. The daimyo wanted merchants and artisans there, offering them security, maybe favorable terms.
Kind of like early enterprise zones.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. Concentrating economic activity right under their noses.
And to make all this work, the farming, the mining, the towns, they must have needed better infrastructure.
Oh, absolutely critical. They invested a lot in building roads, maintaining them,
Connecting the domain.
yep, and setting up post stations, shukueki, along these roads. Hubs for travel, communication, moving goods.
Like surface stations.
Sort of, yeah. And they developed the Tenma system, basically an official transport network, using horses for official business and goods.
Streamlining things.
And interestingly, many daimyo actually got rid of internal checkpoints, the sekisho.
Really? I thought tolls were good income.
They could be, but they also strangled trade within the domain. Abolishing them encouraged the free flow of goods and people, a kind of internal free trade zone.
That's quite forward thinking for the time.
It was practical. They needed their bunkoku economy to function smoothly.
Okay, so that's the Fukoku, enriching the domain. What about the other side? Kyohei strengthening the military?
This was equally crucial, obviously. It involved really reorganizing the warrior class.
How so?
The goal was to bring all the samurai in their territory, from the powerful local lords, the kokujin, right down to the smaller village samurai, the jisamurai, into their direct service. Make them vassals.
Sounds straightforward, but I bet it wasn't.
Oh, definitely not. These samurai often had deep existing ties, loyalties to their own villages, the samura,
Right, local communities.
and ties to the old landholding structures, the shun, even if they were breaking down. So you had these competing loyalties.
Like trying to herd cats with swords.
Something like that.
Yeah.
You're trying to impose a new centralized loyalty over older, more local ones.
So what was the long-term aim?
Ultimately, the daimyo wanted direct control over those villages, the samura, and to basically dismantle the Shuan system altogether. Consolidate all resources and authority under themselves.
Okay. And how did they manage the military obligations? How did they know who owed what service?
They brought in systems like the kandaka.
Kandaka. What's that?
It was a way of assessing a vassal's land, not just its size, but its potential annual yield, calculated in monetary terms kanman.
Ah, putting a value on it.
Exactly. And that assessed value, the kandaka, became the basis for how much military service that vassal had to provide. So many soldiers for so many days based on your land's worth.
That sounds much more standardized, more predictable than older systems.
Much more. It allowed for more efficient mobilization, less guesswork.
What other military structures did they use?
Well, there were systems for integrating new vassals, things called chakuryo and karate.
Okay.
Basically, when a daimyo brought new samurai into his service, they were often assigned to serve under one of the established, more powerful vassals.
Like putting them in an existing unit. A mentoring system.
Sort of, yeah. It helped integrate them, build loyalty within the structure. Kind of like an onboarding process for warriors.
Makes sense.
And underpinning all of this, the economy, the military was the need for information, so they carried out land surveys, kenchi.
Kenchi, like a census of the land.
Pretty much. Comprehensive surveys to figure out who owned what, how productive the land was, the overall wealth of the domain.
That data must have been gold.
Absolutely vital. For calculating taxes accurately, for knowing your military potential. You can't rule effectively if you don't know what you actually rule.
Right. So beyond the economy and the army, how did they actually impose order? Day-to-day control? Was it just military force?
Not entirely. This is where their domain laws come in the bunkoku-ho.
Bunkoku-ho, domain laws. So each daimyo had their own legal code.
Essentially, yes. Their own set of rules for their territory. These laws are fascinating because they show us exactly what the daimyo were worried about, what they wanted to control.
Is your real insight into their priorities.
Definitely. A direct reflection of their authority and their governing strategy.
So what kind of things were typically in these bunkoku-ho? What did these rule books cover?
Well, a really common one was rules about disputes between vassals.
Arguments between samurai.
Exactly. And you often see the principle of kenkario seibai.
Kenka sebai. Punishing both sides.
That's the traditional understanding, yeah.
Yeah.
Punish both parties involved in a quarrel, regardless of who was right.
Seems a bit rough.
Well, the modern thinking is that it wasn't really about fairness in our sense. It was about stopping private wars.
Ah, so preventing vassals from settling scores themselves.
Precisely. You
Yeah.
can't have your retainers fighting each other. It weakens the whole domain.
Mm.
The daimyo wanted to be the sole authority for resolving disputes, centralized justice, or at least conflict resolution.
Keep them focused on serving him, not feuding. Makes strategic sense.
Exactly.
What other kinds of rules were common?
They often banned vassals from making private alliances with each other.
To stop factions forming.
Yep. Don't want anyone building up an independent power base that could challenge you. Restrictions on selling or dividing land were also typical.
Why that?
To keep vassal land holdings intact and economically viable so they could, afford to perform their military duties.
Okay.
And of course, lots of rules aimed at controlling the peasants. Forbidding tax evasion, stopping them from deserting the land. Got to keep the workforce and the tax base stable.
So these laws really show the daimyo trying to assert control over everyone, vassals, peasants, the whole system.
Absolutely. They're a clear demonstration of that drive for centralized authority.
Were these laws always just imposed from the top down?
Mostly, but interestingly not always. We have examples like with the Rokaku clan in Omi or the Sagara in Higo, where their Bonkokuho seems to have been created through some kind of agreement or consultation between the daimyo and their main vassals.
Really? So a bit of negotiation involved.
It suggests that, yeah, even powerful daimyo sometimes needed to build consensus, especially with their key retainers, to make sure the rules stuck and the domain remained stable. It wasn't always pure dictation.
Are there any famous examples of these bunkokuho that historians study?
Oh, yes. One of the best known is the Asakura Takakage articles. The Asakura Takakage Jojo.
From where?
From Ichizen Province. It was traditionally attributed to Asakura Toshikage, sometimes called the 17 Articles of Asakura Toshikage.
Okay.
It gives a really detailed picture of the kind of rules a Sengoku daimyo put in place. Though, like a lot of history, our understanding of who exactly wrote it and what it was originally called has, evolved over time.
But it's still a key document for understanding their governance.
Definitely. A prime example.
And something else changed too, didn't it? How they authorized documents. Less signatures, more seals.
That's right. We see Sengoku daimyo increasingly using seals in ban on official papers.
Instead of just their fancy signature, the cash.
They still use kash, but seals became much more common for official business. It added another layer of formality, of authority, a clear visual mark of the daimyo's command.
Any cool examples?
Oh yeah. The Hojo clan used a tiger seal, which is pretty memorable.
A tiger, nice.
Oda Nobunaga famously used one inscribed Tenkafubu.
Rule the realm by force, not subtle.
Not at all. Shows his ambition clearly. The Takeda used a dragon seal. These weren't just bureaucratic tools. They were powerful symbols of their legitimacy and power.
Okay, so the daimyo are consolidating power, setting up laws, building economies, but it wasn't like they were the only players on the field, right? This period also saw other groups rising up, sometimes challenging the daimyo.
That's a crucial point. It wasn't just a simple story of daimyo getting stronger. There were other significant autonomous powers operating and often clashing with them.
Like who?
Well, a major example is the Iko-Ikki.
The religious uprisings. Followers of the Ikko sect of Buddhism.
Exactly. Pure land Buddhism. And they weren't just a spiritual movement. They could be a powerful military and political force.
How powerful.
Incredibly powerful sometimes. The most dramatic early example is in Kyoga Province back in 1488.
What happened there?
The local Iko-Ikki followers actually overthrew the official Shugo daimyo of the province, the Togashi clan.
Wow, they kicked out the governor.
Kicked him out and basically took over. They established their own rule in Kaga. Imagine a religious community seizing control of an entire province and running it themselves.
That's amazing. How on earth did they manage that?
A lot of the groundwork was laid by a really influential monk named Renyo.
Renyo, okay.
He really revitalized the Honganji branch of Pure Land Buddhism. He was brilliant at organizing. He set up these tight-knit religious groups called Ko within the villages, the Somura.
The grassroots organizing.
Totally. And he spread the teachings using simple, easy-to-understand letters, the Ifumi. This created this incredibly strong, motivated network of believers.
And that network became a political force.
In Kaga, yes. Led by local monks, the Bozu, and allied with some local lords, Kokujin, they mobilized, defeated the Togashi, and then governed Kaga based on sort of collective decision-making for almost a century.
That's incredible longevity for that kind of rule.
It really is. Shows the power of that religious and social cohesion.
Was Kaga unique, or did the Iko-Iki have influence elsewhere?
Oh, they spread quite widely, especially in central Japan, where village communities, the Samura, are strong. They got involved in lots of conflicts with Sengoku daimyo.
Like the famous Ishiyama Honganji.
Exactly. The uprisings centered on the Ishiyama Honganji Temple Fortress in Osaka were a massive headache for Oda Nobunaga for years, a really serious challenge to daimyo authority.
So religious groups were one source of autonomous power. What about cities? I seem to recall Kyoto's townspeople becoming quite influential.
Yes, absolutely. In Kyoto, especially after the Onin War had wrecked large parts of the city, the Machishu played a huge role.
The Machishu, the townspeople. Merchants mostly.
Often wealthy merchants and artisans, yes. And many of them were followers of the Nichiren sect of Buddhism,
Yeah.
another sect that was popular among commoners, particularly from the 15th century.
How did they wield power in Kyoto, which was still technically the capital?
They got organized. They formed these neighborhood associations or town leagues called machigumi.
Machigumi, okay.
And these machigumi acted like mini self-governing units. They even created their own town regulations, machi-okite.
Their own laws.
Yeah, and they elected their own leaders, jogyoji. This gave them a lot of clout in managing local affairs.
Enough to push back against the authorities.
Sometimes, yes. They could resist the weakened shogunate or powerful local lords like the Hosokawa clan. They even defended the city against peasant uprisings, duiki.
Wow.
And they formed their own religious leagues, too, the Hoki-iki, partly to counter the influence of the Iko-iki in the capital region.
So they were politically and militarily active. What about culture?
Hugely influential. So much of Kyoto's vibrant popular culture during this time comes from the Machishu.
Like what?
The revival of the Gion Festival is a prime example. Those amazing elaborate floats, the Yamahoko. Each one was sponsored and created by a different machigumi.
A display of their wealth and civic pride.
Exactly, a real expression of their collective identity and economic power.
So Kyoto had its Machishu. Were there other types of self-governing cities emerging across Japan?
Yes, definitely. The Sengoku period saw the rise of various kinds of Jichitoshi autonomous cities.
What kinds?
You had port towns like Kuwana or Anotsu thriving on trade. Temple and shrine towns like Uji or Yamada serving pilgrims and benefiting from religious authority.
Right.
And then you had the Jinai-machi. These were often towns that grew up around eco-sect temples. They frequently had defenses like moats and attracted artisans and merchants who enjoyed a fair bit of self-rule under the temple's protection.
And some big merchant cities really took off, didn't they? Like Sakai.
Oh, Sakai is the classic example, along with Hakata down in Kyushu. These places became incredibly wealthy through trade, especially with Ming China.
How did they manage that trade?
They often allied themselves with powerful daimyo who could help facilitate it, like the Hosokawa or the Ochi clans.
And how were they governed?
They developed their own governing bodies. In Sakai, it was an assembly of powerful merchants called the Kaigosho.
Kaigoshi.
And in Hakata, it was a council of elders, the Ninyoji. These bodies essentially ran the cities, collecting taxes, administering justice. They became pretty independent from direct feudal control.
Almost like little city-states.
Very much so, for a time.
But you say for a time, this golden age of autonomous cities didn't last forever.
No, it didn't. As the most powerful Sengoku daimyo grew stronger and started unifying larger regions, they inevitably wanted to control these wealthy independent cities too.
Why? Jealousy.
Partly wanting their wealth, sure, but mostly it was about centralization. The daimyo were building their own castle towns as the economic and political centers of their domains.
Right, the Jokomachi.
And to make those jokomachi the undisputed centers, they needed to bring these other independent economic hubs under their control. They started revoking the privileges, the tax exemptions, the self-governing rights they might have granted earlier.
Pulling them back into the fold.
Exactly. Consolidating control over trade routes and resources was key to their larger ambitions.
Can we look at Sakai again as an example of this decline? How did it play out there?
Sure. Sakai, near modern Osaka, was perfectly located. It boomed after the Onin War, especially through trade with China, often in partnership with the Hosokawa. The townspeople, led by the Kaigosho, became incredibly wealthy and powerful. They built serious defenses, moats, walls, hired guards. They ran their own affairs.
Like a fortress city.
It really was. Contemporary Europeans who visited were amazed. Some even called it a republic, which gives you an idea of its perceived independence.
A republic in feudal Japan? That's striking. So what brought it down?
Well, under the Kaigosho, Sakai wasn't just rich. It was a center for culture and technology. The tea ceremony flourished there, printing, even early firearms
The
manufacturing.
advanced stuff.
Very. But its independence eventually put it on a collision course with the great unifiers, specifically Oda Nobunaga.
What happened?
Nobunaga was consolidating his power and demanded huge sums of money from Sakai to fund his campaigns. Sakai, perhaps overconfident, refused.
His mistake.
Huge. Nobunaga didn't take no for an answer. He forced the city into submission. Later, Toyotomi Hideyoshi went further, filling in Sakai's defensive moats.
Symbolically and literally ending its independence.
Pretty much. That really marked the end of Sakai's long tradition of self-rule. And that pattern centralization by the big daimyo squeezing out these autonomous pockets became common as Japan moved towards unification.
Okay, so let's try and pull this together. We've seen the Sengoku daimyo rise from the chaos after the Onin War.
Often through Geikokujo, that lower overthrowing higher dynamic.
Right. And they set about governing their domains, their bunkoku, with that core idea, fukoku kyuhei.
Enrich the domain, strengthen the military, using economic policies, military reforms, land surveys.
Then establishing their own domain laws, the bunkokuho, to keep control over vassals and peasants alike.
But it wasn't a simple linear process. They faced challenges from powerful autonomous groups.
Like the Ikoiki religious movements and those self-governing cities, the Jichitoshi, like Sakai.
Exactly. These groups flourished for a time, demonstrating alternative forms of power and community in the Sengoku era.
But ultimately, as the most powerful daimyo consolidated their grip, these autonomous entities were absorbed or suppressed.
Yes, the Sengoku daimyo fundamentally reshaped Japan's social and political landscape, really laying the foundations for a more unified, centralized state that came next.
Which brings us to a final thought for you as you dig deeper into Japanese history. Think about this. How did all these efforts by the Sengoku daimyo, initially focused just on strengthening their own domains, actually pave the way for the later unification of the entire country under figures like Nobunaga, Hideyoshi, and Tokugawa?
Yeah, what specific things that they did, their economic policies, the way they organized their samurai, their legal ideas, even how they dealt with those independent cities. Which of those elements do you think were most crucial in making unification possible?
That's a great question. Connecting the fragmented world we've talked about today to the unified Japan that followed, something to definitely ponder.